How's it going, everybody? I'm Dalton Moffat, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Primo Levi's book, Survival in Auschwitz. And more specifically, I'm going to be talking about Primo Levi's Gray Zone, which are his thoughts, feelings, his reflections, and honestly, it's kind of just like his moral and ethical standpoint on how everybody was treated and everything that they endured while they were imprisoned at Auschwitz. So the first time while I was reading this book, both times actually when I was reading this book, his gray zone first appears to me on page 21. At this point, it's his early initiation in Auschwitz, and he's quoted here saying, "We have reached the bottom. It is not possible to sink any lower than this. No human condition is more miserable than this, nor could it conceivably be so. Nothing belongs to us anymore. They have taken our clothes, our shoes. They will eventually even take our names." On page 34, Primo Levi has spent about 2 weeks within Auschwitz now, and he mentions that his body is starting to physically change, as a result from being in Auschwitz. He mentions that his skin's turning pale, his stomach's starting to swollen, and hunger has started setting in. He and the other Italians at this point have decided to stop meeting with each other every Sunday. Because every time they meet, they find their numbers lessening, their group size growing smaller. And he decides it's too difficult to dwell on the past. It's too sad for him. His spirit at this point is starting to change. On page 38 and 39, Primo Levi is discussing a conversation with another inmate named Steinloff. Primo Levi states that there are only 10 minutes a day between the reveille call and when work begins. He states that eventually we will all die. We are all about to die. And he would rather spend those 10 minutes looking up at the sky because it might be his last time. Or he'd rather allow himself to indulge in an idle moment of luxury, where he has to do nothing rather than shower. Whereas Steinloff finds it important to shower. He likes being clean. That's what Steinloff does to survive. Whereas Primo Levi refuses to. He thinks it's pointless because within minutes of showering, he's going to be carrying coal sacks and just getting filthy all over again. So he'd rather spend that time doing something different. Okay. So on page 99, Primo Levi offers his words on the importance of everybody's story that is imprisoned and subject to the Holocaust, whether they're imprisoned at Auschwitz with him, Treblinka, or any other concentration camp. He wants to stress their importance. He says he knows that the stories may not be uplifting or happy, but he wants to stress how dire and terrible the situations are where they were placed. He says that we are convinced that no human experience is unworthy of analysis, and the fundamental values, even if they are not positive, they can be denounced from this particular world in which they're describing. The world that he's talking about is really the concentration camps, the lager, what they are used to at this point and what they are subject to at this point. On page 119 to about 123, Primo Levi discusses about wanting to work in a special commando. He knows that he can save himself if he can work in one of these commandos. And on page 123, Primo Levi discusses a meeting with Dr. Panowitz, the doctor that's going to be giving Primo Levi his chemistry examination. Primo Levi discusses about a look the doctor gives him. This particular look he describes as like looking into an aquarium window, a glass aquarium. He describes it as a look between two beings who are in different worlds. Primo Levi is discussing about, and he's thinking that the doctor must be thinking that this something in front of me belongs to a species which is obviously opportune to be suppressed. One has to make sure that it does not contain any or some usable element, meaning that the Nazis, the SS, and other Jewish German, German individuals wanted to make sure, even within the Jewish people, that there wasn't something that they could be used. Prior to this, Primo Levi was a chemist. Therefore, he is now being given a chemistry exam to see if he can be used by the SS. On page 135, we are now in August of 1944, and Primo Levi discusses that they are now the old inmates of the camp. Many before them have died. They are now considered to be the old ones. They've been there the longest at this point. He states that our wisdom lay in not trying to understand, not imagining the future, not tormenting ourselves as to how and when it would all be over, and not asking others or ourselves any questions. Primo Levi knows that it's not important to ask questions, and rather it's useless to ask questions. On page 144, Primo Levi discusses the words of hunger, tiredness, anger, fear, and pain. He states that these words were created and used by free men who were living in their homes, suffering as you and I may do. He mentions that if the prison camps, the concentration camps, and the war had lasted much longer, that these words that we consider to be so bad would be much worse. Because if these camps had lasted much longer, Primo Levi believes that words in a much harsher language would have been created as an effect. He's talking about this, and he believes that this language would be created because their situation was just so terrible. Everything that they were subject to was awful. And Primo Levi knows that, had this continued on, a much terrible and harsher language would have come of it. On page 150, Primo Levi discusses the selection process, where they may or may not be sent to extermination. He's talking about another inmate there named Rene, where he believes that the SS mixed up Rene and Primo Levi's cards, and Primo Levi believes that he was the one to be sent to extermination rather than Rene. Primo Levi, is obviously very frail. He describes himself generally as just not a strong individual. But Rene is sentenced to selection, where he will be killed, and Primo Levi will live on. And he mentions that he doesn't feel emotion over this. Obviously, Auschwitz is changing him. On page 181, for months now, the inmates of Auschwitz have been hearing the distant gunfire and booms of the war. Now the Russians are near. This is about January 11th, 1945. And Primo Levi at this point has fallen ill of scarlet fever, and he's been sent to Kabe, the camp hospital. He discusses an encounter with a barber at the camp, who knows that the Russians are near, and Primo Levi states that the news does not excite any direct emotion in him, and he even states that for months now he hasn't felt pain, joy, or fear. This is considered to be a very common condition in the lager. This happens a lot. It happened to many people. Primo Levi talks about that if he was his former self, his former sensitive self, he thinks that this conversation would have sparked something within him, joy, fear. He feels that this conversation with the barber here at the camp would have been a moving moment. Primo Levi's gray zone is honestly just his thoughts and reflections. It kind of takes like a moral and ethical standpoint at sometimes too. And throughout the book here, we even see a lot of us and the them debates between the Germans and the Jewish people. Primo Levi's gray zone offers a very good insight as to how these people were subject to, during World War II, and what they faced inside these concentration camps. He paints a very good picture through his gray zone and through his opinions of what it was like for them. I appreciate everybody joining in for me here on this podcast. It's been, a true pleasure to speak with every one of you and especially to read this amazing book. I appreciate all of your time. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you again. Enjoy.